Good of welcome to tonight's shiur, Motzei Shabbos, Parshas Yisro, and start off with a Maisa, which I heard today by a Farbrengen. We had a guest in Sanford Hill, a Blazer, there's an Edelman. He told the following story that I guess recently there's a Shliach in Eretz Yisrael by the name of Rabbi Yankel Reitzes, and one of his sons lives in Chulon, was approached by a couple if he would officiate for their wedding, which is going to take place in Haifa. He said okay, and the documentation went through Rabbanut Harashit, and it was all fine. And so he comes on the set day, and he comes to Haifa, to a kosher restaurant with a good hechsher, to perform this wedding. He looked at the Carla, he wasn't convinced she didn't look so Jewish, but she's pastor Rabbanut Harashit, so okay. And then it looks like people who are not so terribly religious. And then, as they're kind of preparing to go to the wedding, a van arrives, and a father and four sons arrive from Har Nof. He with a big beard, and they all holding their Gemaras, not to waste a spare minute. Turns out that these are the brothers and the father of the Chosn. And a quiet moment before the wedding, the father speaks to this young Rabbi Reitzes, and he says, I'm sure this wedding is happening b'schus the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He's interested. So, because this boy had been one of the top bochrim in Mir, but then something happened and he snapped, whatever, and he went off to America, and he was mamash and shayal practice, whatever he was involved with, and the fact that he's getting married with a chuppah v'kedushin is nothing short of a miracle, and he attributes this to Lubavitcher Rebbe. Why so? So he says, the father says, my mother worked as a secretary for Rabbi J.J. Hecht in New York. And going back years, it was a time where there was going to be a Lag B'omer parade. And it was working day and night. It was like a very, very hectic till the parade happened. And I actually was a young boy, and I passed by the Rebbe, as would be, the Rebbe would view all the children passing by, and the Rebbe waved to me. And he believes that this chus of his mother being so devoted to the Rebbe's activities, so the Rebbe look after his son to bring him back, get married to chuppah v'kedushin. Very nice. Meanwhile, the son, the chosen, says to Rabbi Reitzes, he says, by the chuppah, you do all the kibudim. You do this brachas erosin. You read the ksubah. You read all the 7 brachas afterwards. Don't give it to anyone else. So it looks like there was attention there, regardless. And I'll tell you a story afterwards. That's what the chosen says. Okay, he officiates, runs the chasana. After the chuppah is over, the chosen tells him, as you may know, that this is my mashpocha, and I went all the way away from Yiddishkeit, and in part of that hefkedus, I had to do with several women at different times, and then I met this woman, and we were living together, and then I had a dream, and I saw the Lubavitcher Rebbe in the dream. Now, although we didn't have pictures of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in our house, it wasn't our minhag, but of course I recognized who it was. And he says, it's pastish a Jewish boy and a Jewish girl should be living together without chuppah v'kedushin. Now, I didn't know that she was Jewish. And then I dismissed the dream. She saw I was a little bit anxious, but I said nothing. I had the dream 3 times. And so then I shared it with her. And then we decided, okay, we're going to get married properly with a proper chuppah, despite everything else. But they made this, they made the chasna in Eretz Yisrael, and this was the chasna. So one of the points which Rabbi Edelman wanted to bring out is that the Rebbe bleibt nicht kebalchev, the Rebbe doesn't remain in debt. You do something for the Rebbe will find a way of rewarding you for your commitment. Okay, so now we have a very interesting question, a very practical question, and it comes to holding the Lechem Mishneh on Shabbos. Someone asked me to try to make a shtickle klorkai to clarify how it goes, what's going on here. So here we have a letter of the Rebbe on the top of the screen. Oifen hanochas alechem mishneh beleil Shabbos l'mocharase. How are you meant to hold the two loaves of the two Challos, Friday night and Shabbos morning? Not Shabbos morning in Lubavitch. By the time you get to there, it's afternoon, but fine. So, Beleil Shabbos, at the night of Shabbos, Zoy Eitzel Zoy, you hold the two loaves next to one another. Olamacharasa, in the following day, Shabbos by day, Ba'ifin Shachala Mimin, Tihya Lamaluksas, Al Hashnio, the right challah should be slightly higher than the left challah. So this is a letter of the Rebbe with no references. Now, it's published in the Shulchan Menachem, and so the notes which you can see, which are on the page, which we'll come back to in a moment, they are from the Shulchan Menachem, which is a collection of most of the Rebbe's letters of Halocho and minhag. Okay, but before we go to those notes, we're going to look at what's written in Shulchan Aruch. So Siman Reish Ayin Dalet tells us, the Shulchan Aruch tells us, this is Rabbi Yosef Karo, that you should beitzei al shtei kikres shleimes, you should break bread from two whole loaves. Shoiches shteim beyodei, and when you say the brocho, you hold both of them. Uvoitzei hatachtoino, you should break off from the lower one. Now, I'm just wondering, I think by the Sfardim it's quite popular to have round, flat kind of pancake type of challis. Not very flat, but it could be about an inch high. Could be that's the kind of loaves they had. And you'd have the two challas, and you'd break off from the lower challah. On this, there are more adds. But dafka beleile Shabbos, the breaking off of the lower challah, is dafka the night of Shabbos. Aval b'yom Shabbos, beleile Yom Tov. But the Shabbos day, or for that matter, even Yom Tov by night, beitzei al ha'elyono, v'hatam hu al derech ha'kabola. Now this is so interesting. We're looking at Shulchan Aruch, and both the Ramah says Kabbalah, and the Mechaber here doesn't say in Bes Yosef, he says Al Pi Kabbalah, but they do not explain the Kabbalah reasons. I guess they trust those who understand Kabbalah will know anyways. But so here we have Al Pi Nigla. This is curious. It's Nigla based on Kabbalah, yeah. So Al Pi Nigla, you're meant to hold the two loaves, one on top of the other, and break off the lower one by night. By day, you break off the upper one. So that is what we have Al Pi Nigla. And now we're going back to what we have. No, that's not that. Here we go. And then we have what the Rebbe is saying, to hold Friday night, the two challahs not one on top of the other, but parallel, back to back. It doesn't say that in detail, but we'll come to that. And by day, the right challah should be slightly higher. Now this interest was triggered because of the Torah 2 weeks ago. Well, let's take a look at the Torah where it says the following. Towards the end of Parshas B'Shalach, where we have the story of the Mon, etc., Achar ze kol ze, we understand the union of Shtei Alechem B'Shabbos. Al Pi Nigla, Sorich Laniach Zoy Al Gabei Zoy, should be one on top of the other. And that's what we just saw. It means Al Pi Nigla was written in Shulchan Aruch, one on top of the other. Because a Nigla is B'Bchinas, Hishtalshlus B'Chinas Er Yasher. In Kabbalah, we have two forms of Er. One is called Er Yasher, it's coming in a direct form. And then there's another form, which is Er Chayze, which is a reflective light, which is understood as a higher level, more makif. But meanwhile, so he says, Al Pi Nigla, there's the upper and the lower, that's Er Yasher. And that's the way of Ishtalshalus. That's a higher and the lower, cause and effect, etc. Beginas nister, but from the aspect of nister, or beginas erchaizer. We're talking about a much higher light, which is a reflective light, and talks about makif hakloli, and therefore, al pi nister, the two chalas should be zoy betzad zoy. They should be shteyem b'shove. The two chalas should be equal. And that's true. Eskalus makif milo matter shovin. The two chalas have to be equal. There's no upper and lower. They're both parallel. Then he quotes here from the Kutatera about having the two chalas achereihem haboiso. That means the bottom of the chalas are held back to back. Apneihem chutz. Lechutz liyes kule ponim. As if it's got just a face. It doesn't have a back. That's similar to, I saw in the Kabbalah, they bring about lechem haponim. The lechem haponim had two faces on either side, from the front and from the back. It had two faces. So we hold the two chalas as if we've got two faces. There's no back. The back is hidden. Then he quotes from the Sidurim Dach, holding the two lechem, same idea, having the back to back, and they should be parallel. And the source is Priyat Chaim, etc. Okay. Very well. So we have here that in Torah A, he talks about having the two loaves parallel. Good, very good. So that we understand what the Rebbe says. The question which this Ingerman had to me was, I understand that, but how come that Shabbos by day, the rules are slightly different? The right challah should be higher, because generally the general drift in Chassidus is that Friday night is a lower kedusha. It's a Shabbos to negate the weekday, and Shabbos by day is a higher kedusha. It's Shabbos kodesh be'etzem, whatever the language is. So his question was, how come that Shabbos by day, if the reason for having the two chalalos parallel is got to do with Or Chayzer and Makiv, and that's the atmosphere for Shabbos, is such a high exposure of a Makiv, whatever the pshat is, how come by day it seems to be less? It seems to be like Or Yosher by day, and by night Or Chayzer, which that doesn't fit with the general drift that by day is a higher Or than by night. That is his question, which I'm afraid I'm not going to give you an adequate answer, but I'm going to still try to explore the topic. So let's take a look here. What we have on the screen is from the Kaf HaChaim, which the Kaf HaChaim lived, 80 years ago. And he was Malakid. He brought a lot of Kabbalah stuff from the Arizal, from the Kisvi Arizal. And now the Arizal taught to have actually 12 chalas for your Shabbos meal. All three meals should have 12 chalas. And there are some Rebbes today who have that minhag. Apparently, the minhag of doing chalas, braiding chalas with three braids, three strands, and then an upper layer. So in effect, you've got six strands in those chalas. That style of making chalas with six strands is meant to be reminiscent of the inyan of Shtei HaLechem, where you have the two, sorry, not Shtei HaLechem, of Lechem Aponim, where you've got the two stacks of loaves, 6 and 6. So the way Lezecher, you have this minhag of braiding the chalas with 6 strands. But coming back, the Alter Rebbe talks about having literally, let's say, 12 bagels, and you have them positioned in a certain way with 2 segels, etc. Then he says you take from the central ones, which are double-decker, you pick up the right middle one and the left middle one, and you bring them together back to back. And then he goes on, he says the 2 lower loaves on the middle, they are corresponding to the 2 letters of Hey, of Hashem's name. The 2 upper loaves that you're holding in your hand, they correspond to Yud and Vov. So you've got the masculine, the feminine. The ones you're holding in your hand, the masculine. The ones which are on the table are the feminine. And then he says you should break off from the right challah, and you break off the first piece. You break off a kazayas, and that's for yourself. and that's corresponding to the Yud of Hashem's name. And then you break off a second piece, and that's a kabetza, the size of an egg, and that you should give to your wife, and that's corresponding to the ois Rov of Hashem's name. Sorry, here he says something different. He says, yes, well, that's all right, we'll come to that. That's talking about when you only have two challahs. All right, but there is this inyan which we say also in the piyut, in Azam B'Shochin, Lemivtza al rifto kazeso kaveyoso, to break bread, kazayis and a kabeyo. And so it says very clear that you should give first the kazayis for yourself, then the kabeyo to your wife. And you see what he emphasizes here. Even there is someone quite choshev at your table, you shouldn't give him before your wife, because you don't want to separate between the kazayis and the kabeyo. So here he talks about the two yuds of Siruf of Havai and Adni, but Echshir. So we have this inyan of Al Pi Arizal, of having the two loaves of bread, bringing them, as you said, back to back together. I'm just going to go to the next slide, and this is also from the Kaf HaChaim, where he writes the following. Reb Shmuel Vital, who the son of Reb Chaim Vital, who is the one who recorded the teaching of the Arizal, including Pri Etz Chaim. So he says he would normally take the two upper loaves and hold them together. If someone has only got two loaves totally, then he should have in mind the upper one is keneged ois yud of ois vov, and the lower one is keneged the two heis. That's I mentioned just before. When you've got just two, it's the upper ones. Oh, here it's yud and vov, and the lower ones are corresponding to the two heis. But then he adds, you should yagbiya ha'elyoin ma'at v'datachten. Oh, so now for all this struggle, we found a psashtikal moker, but the Rebbe said in that letter that you should hold the right one a bit higher than the left one. Yeah, this is in Siman Reish Samach Beis. In Siman Reish Ayin Dalet, he writes, according to Kabbalah, you should break from the upper one, and there's no difference between by day and by night. So let's try to unravel what's going on here. So we have, as I said, we have them, the Shulchan Aruch says, to have the two together, Friday night, break from the upper one. We have a problem with that. Come Seder night, with the whole Seder of Eim Avir and Ela Mitzvahs, and therefore we break off the upper matzah because of Eim Avir and Ela Mitzvahs. So how can you deal with breaking the lower one? So they do some kind of shtick of bringing the lower one should be a little bit further forward to yourself. But there is a problem of breaking the lower one is a problematic laloch. Comes along the Arizal and says instead of having them one on top of the other, which is going to present you a problem of Eim Avir and Ela Mitzvahs, so hold them together. So then, and you break off the right one. With this, it's taken not from the lower one, but it's not the higher one. So you've, in a way, partially fulfilled the both the Arizal and okay. Comes by day, but Al Pi Halocho, you should be breaking from the upper one. And then Al Pi Arizal, you should be holding them parallel. But by day, there's no problem to fulfill both in Yonim, to have them parallel and to have one slightly higher. And so you mekayim, as it says in Shulchan Aruch, b'yoyim yivtza min ha'elyon, min ha'elyono, and you also mekayim the Arizal to have them parallel. So again, by night to lift one higher, but that would be against what the Machaber says. Then by night should be min ha'tachtono. Therefore, by night you keep them just parallel. You can't lift the right one any higher because it's against what the Machaber says, which is al pi Kabbalah. But by day you can kind of reconcile. You can have the right one slightly higher, and with this you mekayim both the position al pi halacha. You should be betzeh from the elyoin, and you also it's shove b'shove So it's you Makayim this Inyan, which is our Pikabola, that they should be both parallel. Bottom line is, just remember, after all this whole pilpul, Friday night you hold the two Challos parallel, back to back, and in the morning, the Shabbos day, you hold the right one slightly higher. I remember the Rebbe making Hamoitzi. Must have been Rosh Hashanah, and there were two large round Challos. He held them back to back. Then he took with his knife and made like a circular motion without touching. It was just like a circular hovering over the Challos. That's what I remember. I'm sure some people remember more detail. Okay, let's move on to the next question. So, someone kindly sent me a whole range of pictures, photographs of various types of sports jackets and asking about tzitzis. So, as you can see, the sports jackets have got, because of the zippers, so they are square. There's a right angle or a 90-degree corner, both at the top and at the bottom. Unlike the hoodie, which we're getting close to Purim, like Yehudim. So the hoodie doesn't have the problem of tzitzis because it goes straight from the zipper straight up to the hood. But all of these sports jackets and cardigans or sweaters in America, they all have this problem of having square at the bottom and square at the top. Now, I did discuss this a few years ago, but this fellow generously sent me all these photographs, so I wanted to share them with you, and we'll look at the halacha now. So now we have here in Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, he talks about garments which are common in Germany and Spain, which are open in the front from top to bottom, and they've got therefore four corners, two at the top and two at the bottom. They're potter from tzitzis, because the mitzvah of tzitzis is primarily to the front and to the back. But here, where all the four corners are to the front and they can't be worn differently, then one could argue there's no chiyuv to have tzitzis. And that's why it's common practice that people do not bother with tzitzis on jackets which have a square towards the bottom and towards the top, towards the collar. Aval kol yirei shamayim rachmil atzmoi. For yourself, your yirei shamayim, you should be careful to make one of those corners round, so that you shouldn't have four square corners. Now that's with a zipper jacket. To start making a round corner, I just find that very awkward to carry out. Fine. So, but here's an diuk which I've often noticed. Yirei shamayim yachmil atzmai. It's not for you to start preaching to others that they should be machmir, but for yourself, okay. For yourself, don't wear such a jacket without cutting rounding a corner. That's in the Shulchan Aruch. But then we look in the Sidur, where the Alter Rebbe has about 4 pages on tzitzis, and he addresses the same thing. And here he's more right. There is a view that the Sidur was written for Chassidim, and therefore there's a netiyah lahachmir. There's a tendency to be stricter. So here malbushim shelonu, which means our jackets, which have 2 corners in the front, at the bottom, and 2 corners at the front, at the top, by the neck. One should be careful to make the upper corners rounded, as has become customary of late. Now, I'm in my work on the Sidur, I question, why does the Alter Rebbe prefer rounding the upper corners to the lower corners? I don't think I have an answer. But meanwhile, he says, better to have the upper corners rounded. So whereas in the Shulchan Aruch it said, in the Sidur he writes this as a guidance for Chassidim, for whoever's using the Sidur, that they should be careful not to wear such a type of jacket without rounding the corners. So, right. So Yirei Shamayim, Achmil Atzboy, a Chassid who follows the Alter Rebbe, and the Sidurs, so it's written for us, so we should avoid that. What it really means, act practically, that such a kind of cardigan, such a kind of sweater, does present a problem for a Chassid. I'm not talking about all those sports jackets, which might not be beholden for a pasik for Chassidish in any case, but a cardigan, fine. Let's move on. Since we're talking about tzitzis, so here comes another question about tzitzis. And someone asked me, why does the Alter Rebbe, well, the Alter Rebbe advises to cut the corner, to round the corner of a blanket. Why is that not done? We don't see that widely followed. So this is again in Shulchan Aruch. On the top we have about sheets and karim is not so clear. So they are basically night garments. Now here's the problem. According to Tosfos, it goes according to the garment, whether it's designated for night or for day. But according to Rashi and the Rambam, if you wear a night garment during the day, you have to have tzitzis. So the fact that it's a night garment is not an exemption. So according to those who say that ksus laila, a night garment, is chayv tzitzis you're wearing by day, so then your sheets need to have tzitzis, because you odom yoshim behem b'boker. You wake up and it's already after daybreak and there's no tzitzis. And the minhag is not to. And some say it's because it's only if it's mamish, a garment that you wear as a garment, but not just as a sheet. But others disagree with this. Therefore, if your sheet is made of wool, then you should round the corner to solve the problem. So here's this interesting how he talks about. Here he mentions a difference between a woolen sheet or a different material. Now then we take a look at the Sidur. A cover, shekorin koldre. When I was brought up, and my parents called it a koldre, a blanket. Shemiskasim boy keshayoshin b'yayim. Even though it's ikre miyuchid l'laylo, even though it's primarily a night cover, you should make it a round corner to exempt from tzitzis livrei hakel. Now here the Alter Rebbe does not differentiate whether it's made of wool or not. And it's interesting that in this Sidur there's no mention about wearing the talis should be made of wool. Interesting. But meanwhile he doesn't mention that difference. And so therefore, according to the Sidur, a koldre, a blanket you should round off the corner. Now, when I saw this and started looking, I was puzzled with the wording here. And here the Alter Rebbe has thrown a very, very interesting difference to what he said in the Shulchan Aruch. In the Shulchan Aruch, he'd said that the need for tzitzis is odom yoshen bohen ba'boker, which I understand that means that your night sleep overflows into daybreak, into day, and therefore you have a problem with the tzitzis. Here he says very different. He says miskasin boy kesheyoshen boyoim. Only if you go to sleep during the day. That makes a very big difference. And what he's saying is that in the Sidur, that the only issue of having to have tzitzis on a blanket is only if you're one of those gentlemen who tend to take a shlof, a nap in the afternoon. Then you have to worry about having tzitzis. But if you only wear it, if it's a night blanket and they overflow into the day, that's not a problem. Now, when I see such a diuk, Kiddush, and it's Kiddush to say what? That although the Rambam says a square garment has to have tzitzis, that's only if you put it on by day. But if you are sleeping and it stayed on you, then it's not a problem. So here we have from the Alter Rebbe. Now, the Alter Rebbe was a generation perhaps before the Alter Rebbe. In the Shulchan Aruch, Kimat, the Alter Rebbe doesn't mention the Alter Rebbe. But in Sidur, it seems to Alter Rebbe is a likut al Seder. It's a commentary on the Levush. He's got a short commentary called Elezuta and the longer commentary is Elya Rabbah, is a malachate. But okay. Shuv Motzosi Begilian Shulchan Aruch. Says the Elya Rabbah found on the margin of a Shulchan Aruch, it doesn't say who it is. Hoyin v'ein hascholas tashmish b'yoyim. If you don't start using it by day, lo mikri tashmish yoyim afilu lo Rambam atkan v'nochoinu. Comes with this very big chiddush that even the Rambam, who says that if you put on a night garment, a square night garment during the day, you have to put on tzitzis. That's only if you put it on during the day. But if it is a continuum of you wearing at night, then you do not need to worry about tzitzis, even according to the Rambam. So that corroborates, and that's possibly the source of the Alter Rebbe's wording, sheyoshen b'yoyim. Having said that, that may explain why it's not widely followed to cut off corners of blankets, because most of us do not take a nap by day with a blanket. As Reb Mendel put it fast by the Farbrengens, a bocher would come in late to the Farbrengen on the Shabbos afternoon, and you schlafen noch mit the pajamas, yeah? So to go during the day to have a rest, it's unusual for, at least for younger people at least. When, yes, Shabbos, you have to have a shlaf. Shabbos is Rosh Hashanah, Shina b'Shabbos Tainug, yeah? It says also in Arizal about having a rest on Shabbos afternoon. On Shabbos, the whole business of tzitzis is much more lenient, because the halacha is, if you come into a shul and the only talus there is a talus, you're embarrassed to be without a talus. The only talus there is got postel tzitzis, so you're allowed to put it on. You have a mitzvah of putting on tzitzis. On Shabbos, you can't carry it out, so you're onus. So therefore, of course, you can't chas v'shol to make a brocho, but on Shabbos, putting on a four-cornered garment on Shabbos, you cannot be faulted for that, because you cannot carry out the chiyuv of putting on tzitzis. There's no Yisro. There's no Yisro to put on a garment without tzitzis. There's a mitzvah. When you put on a garment of four corners, the mitzvah, go and put on tzitzis. On Shabbos, I can't do it. And therefore, it's nishkas geferlach. That could be the cheshbon why it's not so widespread. If you have a blanket and you do often use it by day, then of course there is a chumrah to be to a corner to round off a corner. Right. So what do we have here? Yeah. Someone is pointing out the clothing is usually synthetic, not wool or linen. I'll ask him. But we halocha, even if it's not wool or linen, there's still a shiur of tzitzis. It's also midrabanon, but right. Let's go on to number 4. Right. I don't know whether I have a slide for that. I don't think so. Should you wear a gartel for benching? So I did see I saw in Piskei Teshuvos, he brings in Simukov Begimel, he brings that some people were particular, some Rebbes, some Gute Yidden were particular to wear a gartel for benching. My son tells me that he used to have Friday night, that Bochrim would come to him for the Shabbos meal. And it was a very special time. He would tell stories and whatever. It was like a Farbrengen. And so Rebbe was particular to put on a gartel for Birchas Hamazon. I wouldn't say that's the standard minhag. What came up to me today, this one just recently, talking about Birchas Hamazon is on par with Shemona Esrei as far as hafsokah. That as far as interrupting, if you hear Omen Yishmei Rabba, let's say, middle of Birchas Krishma, you meant to answer. If you're middle of bentshing, I don't know why you're benching when there's a kaddish being said, but fine, if that happens, it's the same level as Shemona Esrei that you don't answer. And because it's a mitzvah min Torah, and I'm just thinking that to register that what you're doing is a mitzvah min Torah, possibly that also the putting on a gartel will help register. It's a difficult one, because you come to benching, you've just eaten and you may be very tired, and so you need to have a bit more zeros, yeah. So it might be a good idea. I haven't done so till now, but possibly when I'm feeling more from. So to put on a gartel for bentshing. Okay. Point number 5. So about saying a brocha when a child is born. So it's written in Shulchan Aruch. Boy is born, Bachas Ateva Metiv, when daughter, when you see the girl, so then you'd say Shechianu. That's the way it's written in Shulchan Aruch. So someone asks, not so, we don't see it so wide, so commonly done. And the simple answer is because the Tatis are a bit overwhelmed and they forget that they should be saying a brocha, so they don't, but not there's anything deeper to it. So someone had written an article saying that the Rebbe had, Rabbi Grona had said that they should ask a Rov. The kids he published this, and so the next week, or 2 weeks later, Rabbi Grona wrote that wasn't what I had told was not about the brocha Teva Ametiv or Shechianu. It was about the Birchas HaGoimel, that whether a mother, the way it's written in Shulchan Aruch and the Alter Rebbe Sidur also, that a mother is given birth, she should say Birchas HaGoimel. She should say it from the Weibershul. And I've told the story before, but never mind, I can tell it again, that I heard that Rebbe Alenik, Alav Shalom, when his first child was born, so he told the Rebbe that his wife stood in the Cheder Sheni and said a Birchas HaGoimel. And the Rebbe kind of in jest said, did the Bochrim, the Zal, did they say Shechianu? The first time they're seeing that a woman would say Birchas HaGoimel. Right, so now, here's the question. If the parents, the mother and father, if they did not say Shechianu or Hateva Metiv right away, can they say Shechianu or Hateva Metiv when they're listening to this podcast? Yeah, still happy, yeah. So this is from the Ksasa Shulchan, and the Pri Megadim he quotes says that if your wife gave birth, you can say Hateva Metiv even Achak Dibur, even 3 seconds later you can still say the bracha. Vidvarov, all good news, you can say the bracha. But how long does it? For how long afterwards can you still say the bracha? It's illogical to say there's no shiur. Possibly so long as we're still engaged in that inyan or that excitement, and you haven't been distracted from the good news, but once you've been distracted to deal with other business, then it's too late to go back and start saying the bracha teva metiv or shechianu. And so that could be why it's common that people don't say the bracha. Right afterwards, they were distracted. Later on, it's already too late to say the bracha, so fine. Right, let's go on. Is there an inyan of washing negelvasser? Now, if in winter, some people get up before dawn and they wash negelvasser next to their bed, and then after they get dressed, wash again, say bichas hashachar, and then it's dawn. Do you have to say brocho negelvasser again when it gets dawn? Now, this on the screen we have from the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch Siman Daled. Now, in the first 4 simonim or 3.5 simonim, there's the Alter Rebbe rewrote them, but Siman Daled is only first 2 seifim, so we don't have the end of the simon. So here we have the Alter Rebbe writes: one who gets up in the morning and washed negelvasser, and he washed 3 times, yeah. It's toiv, it's recommended he should wash again when it turns day again, because there's a possibility that it is the lailo which causes the ruach ra on the hands, even without sleeping. So the Alter Rebbe brings up this svara that the ruach ra for which we wash negelvasser has got to do with lailo rather than sleeping. On that basis, he says you should wash again when the lailo has gone away. So the question is, do we follow this? The Maisa. It is written in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, but my response was we don't follow that, and I'm drawing from the Alter Rebbe Sidur. Now let's read here from the Sidur. Im neir kol halayla, if you were awake a whole night, or you slept less than 30, 60 neshimas, I'm not going to go into detail. Loi shorso olov ruach hatuma klal. Night doesn't bring you ruach hatuma. Ruach hatuma has got to do with sleeping, not to do with night. And therefore, you don't have to wash negelwasser. So there's a sefer written by Talmud Chochem in Benoit. His name is Rabbi Friedland, dedicated to the first few simonim with Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, and he addresses this. He says that the Alter Rebbe in Sidur follows the Zohar, that Ruach HaRuah has got only to do with sleeping and not to do with night. So here we have the Zohar, I think it's Afkuf Samach Beis. No one who sleeps on his bed at night, he has a taste of death. V'nafkas nishmosi minei neshama goes out of him. Because the body is left without the holy neshama, therefore ruach mesrov zomin. Therefore the spirit of impurity is poised, is ready. V'shariole v'stoiv, and he becomes tomei. Akimna milas l'les lehu l'barnash la'avra yodoi al einoi b'tzafro. You shouldn't touch your eyes in the morning without washing. Begin to ruach masov v'shar yalayu until you wash negelvasa. You don't touch your eyes. Bekitzer, the Zohar is quite clear that the ruach hatuma has got to do with sleeping rather than with night, and therefore, despite what's written in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch in Mahadura Kamo, as I said, in Mahadura Basra, this section is missing, but in the Sidur is quite clear that it's got to do with dafka with sleeping, and therefore there's no need to wash again, even without a brocha, kasheyer hayayim. Okay, let's move on. What's the brocha for applesauce? So, this I want to share with you that when I had a short while, I was living in the house of Reb Zalman Shimon Dvorkin, and we had this conversation, and he pulled out the Reb Yaakov Emden Sidur, and he showed me where it says there, apple, shenigmaru, ripe apples, brochas ha'etz, ve'im bishlon, afilu nimoichu legamri. If you cook them, even if they're totally disintegrated, the brocha remains ha'etz. So he showed me that Rabbi Yaakov Emden says the brocha on stewed apple is ha'etz. He also showed me in the same list of brochas the brocha on kugel, on kartoffel kugel, fry or latkes is shahakal, which is both are interesting. Now, possibly he's talking about in his time when they would be cooked without going through a machine to puree them totally. But the main reason why it remains ha'etz is because it's very normal to, even actually in England it's common, you have the apples which are planted for cooking apples. They call them Bramley apples. In America, I heard that they don't have such a thing. But here we have taka apples which are inedible raw, and after they are planted for the purpose of cooking. So stewed apples is a very common product. Therefore, to say, oh, it's been downgraded, it's been made into a stew, therefore it loses its toyar, it loses its chashivas, it's not a strong argument. And he says the brocha is ha'etz. Now about the potato latkes, so I looked around, I saw others bring this Rabbi Yaakov Emden Sidur, and they say that's because the latkes are there, and also you added eggs and you added some flour and perhaps some other ingredients, and because of this it's changed from its original form, and there he says the brocha is shahakal. I want to just make one bavornish, one observation. Rabbi Yaakov Emden lived in a generation before the Alter Rebbe, or two. He publishes his Sidur in the year the Alter Rebbe is born, Tov Kuf Hey. In the original Rabbi Yaakov Emden Sidur, this list isn't there. And so it's Bichal very interesting, an alphabetical list of foods Sounds right. It doesn't sound like daily Yisrael doing that. It seems like more more down to earth people making an alphabetical list of foods with brachas. So it's alphabetical Yiddish, but it's not from Rabbi Yaakov Emden. So if someone wants to challenge it, you're not challenging Rabbi Yaakov Emden, you're challenging whoever was the Chacham who put it together. I didn't manage to research who exactly is the compiler of this list. So you have this, typically today, if people have a Yaakov Emden Sidur, Sidur Beis Yaakov. So it's there. It incorporates from also the Sidur Derech HaChaim, but this is not from the Derech HaChaim, from Rabbi Yaakov Lissa. So who was the author of this list? I don't know. Right. So now we're going on to, I recently made a comment about checking out of a hotel on Shabbos, and in passing made a comment about candlesticks and saying that when you have a bosses ledova also muta, when you want to move a table which has on it muksa and a non-muksa, the non-muksa has to be of greater chashivas than the muksa. So I made a comment that the non-muksa has to be more choshev, more valuable, and not only of the flame, but also more valuable than the candlesticks. And I probably said that the candlesticks nowadays cost over $1,000, and therefore the non-muksa has to be of greater value than that. So someone challenged me on that because the Alter Rebbe talks about that the counterbalance only has to be against the flame, because the flame is muksa. The candlestick, well, the candlestick is a klisha malachte isur, true, but it's muksa to move it. Let's say the immobility of muksa only is only the flame. The candlestick is not a total muksa. So here's my response. So this is from the Alter Rebbe does say so. He's right in Siman Reish Ayin Tes, and this is from the Piskei Teshuvos in the same Siman, and also there's a Sefer Orchis Shabbos, a contemporary Sefer, and they go through this also in detail. Sorry, I don't have it on the screen. And they're saying that it's all very well in those days where a candlestick was not so fancy. It was common to use the candlesticks possibly for something else. And that's why it's not such a rigid muksa. You have the muksa, you're allowed to move it. Serch means you might use it for something else. You might use a screwdriver to hold the door open. You might use a hammer to crack nuts. Oh, I don't know, Chabad, chas v'sholom, but yeah, fine. But fine, you might use it for something else. You might improvise. But then you've got a whole list of stuff which you would never improvise with, and they therefore earn the title Muksa Machmas Chesorinkis. So now, for example, a shoichet's knife, you would got to start cutting string with it. Keep your distance. He's just worked hours on making sure it's honed so smooth and etc. And you start messing around with it. He doesn't, no way. And therefore, even if the shochet himself decides to want to use it as poker and package on Shabbos, he cannot, because it's muksa mechmechesaring his. That's the concept of now. Now, would you use silver candlesticks for anything else but that? Would you use them as a paperweight? Would you use them to keep a door open? I don't think so. You wouldn't use them for anything else. The more valuable they are, and sometimes they're very delicate. You wouldn't use them for anything else. So they become muksa machmas chesorinkis. They become a much greater muksa, more a strict muksa, and therefore you need to counterbalance. So this foreign they bring this and brings for chaznish, but it's starke svora, and that's the case. Can you move the candlesticks kilach hayad with your elbows? Yes. Make sure some people who would care about it aren't looking, because they might faint when you do that. They might drop them. But yes, you're allowed to move any muksa kilach hayad. That's true. Yes. Right. So much for that. How are we doing? Okay. Then someone asks me about the way it's written in the Sidur. Yochid HaMispalel Ein tzorach loima yukumpurkon ze veloy mishaberach. Now this is from the Sidur Torah, as you can see. In the Tilas Hashem Sidur, which there is an expression, guide for dummies, yeah? Tilas Hashem was made for much simpler. You know, so they added the word Yochadam Mispal Bebeisoi. If you daven at home, but it's true. Yochadam Mispal at home, then you shouldn't say this Yokum Purkum, because it talks about this Kehilo, Kahal Kadish Adein, and Mishabeirach talks about Kol HaKol HaKadosh Hazeh. If you're davening at home, how can you talk about this Kehilo when you're davening at home? Question is, what happens if you are in a shul, but you're not davening with a minyan? There's a whole separate farbrengen about this malaise of not davening with a minyan. People davening barichas is one thing, but people who just somehow cannot bring themselves to daven with the minyan, cannot. I have a shtickle chazonis, which I'm not going to share with you now, but Maldas hamokoim, Maldas hakol, onu matirin lispal im haminyonim. That you can, you're allowed to daven with the minyan. But all right, it didn't happen. He's davening on his own, but there's a minyan around. So does he say this? Yes or no? So I would say yes. There's a kehillah here, so he can say it. Now, when I published the Sidur at the time, I could not find an earlier source of this line to differentiate about a yochid who doesn't say, should not say the Yishuk Kumpurkan. Later, somehow, I don't remember how I came across it, but an earlier Sidur published in the year Tov Nun Zayin, that's the year before the Baal Shem Tov is born, and it writes the following. This is in German Yiddish. Die Leid, die euch Yeshuvim, die euch Yeshuvim wohnen, die nicht Minyan mispalel sein, oder wenn nicht Schulen muss ein Shabbos something, then under Yom Purkan and nicht Mishaberach sagen, something like that. So has this line, this guidance that when you don't have it, when you're davening in a place where there's no minyan, to miss out this Yom Purkan and the following Mishaberach because there's no kehillah. So this is not a chiddush of the Alter Rebbe. It was published in Sidurim before the Alter Rebbe's times. You say someone's commenting that some Sidurim say not a sort of Eino Omer, Einit Tzorech Leimar. Here it says Einit Tzorech Leimar, and some say Eino Yomer. Okay, I have a theory which I published in the Sidur actually, that in Yiddish, if you say Medafaz Einishton, doesn't mean you don't need to do it. It means it's not appropriate. So the Yiddish, it's translated to Hebrew, Einit Tzorech, doesn't mean that you don't have to, but it means you shouldn't. That's it's a Yiddishism coming into the Lashon HaKodesh. It's a theory because many times you have Einut Tzorech Levorich. Really, Einut Tzorech Levorich. If you're not meant to, then you don't need to. Then it's a brocho levatala. So you have a list of about 6 or 7 places where you have this Lashon Einut Tzorech, and it should be understood as being it's not appropriate to. There's this I heard from the Shliach in Berlin, Rabbi Tachtel. So when he first, no, when it was Diskin in Munich, when he first came, so there was some cake on the table, some biscuits. So the visitor says, "Muss ich essen?" Now in Yiddish, "Muss ich" means "do I have to eat?" In German, that dialect at least, "Muss ich" means "may I." So there's a biscuit at the table, and the guest says, "Muss ich essen eine Biscuit?" Sagt er, "No, du musst nicht." He says because in Yiddish he says, "You don't. I'm not forcing you. It's free. It's a free will." But in German it means may I. He said, "No, you're not allowed to." So like confusing. And then he also had a problem that all the streets or many streets, they asked him, where's your hotel? So he says, "Oh, my hotel's on Einbahnstraße," which means the one-way street. Fine. Now, just 2 more things. We had this discussion about the bells from a nearby church, And I did quote from the Sefer Divrei Malkiel to say that it's innocent because it's just a public service. It's not a religious thing. So I got from several people a couple of feedbacks. So one is a story of the Tzemach Tzedek. As we know, the Tzemach Tzedek lived in the town of Lubavitch, and then there was a time where he was called to a government conference on chinuch. Lots of stories about that. And Tzemach Tzedek said, the Peterburg bells caused me forgetfulness, because until then, till he had this visit to Petersburg, he didn't know what it means to forget. But when he went in the year Tafresh Gimel to that government conference, and then it was common that the churches had, on days of festivals, lots of ringing, and that caused him, he suffered the inyan of forgetting. So not to dismiss totally. And then here we have another story. The story is about Rav Aaron Kotler in a sefer called Toros Chashash. One of his Talmidim told him that he's now being plagued by heretical thoughts, and he wishes want to convert to Christianity. Rosh Hashiva didn't know what to do, tried to persuade him, it didn't work, so he consulted the Kapishnitzer Rebbe. The Kapishnitzer Rebbe lived, I think, in Crown Heights or perhaps in the Lower East Side, but he was from the Rizhiner dynasty, very close to the Rebbe also. And the Kapishnitzer said he should find out how the young man sets his watch. Rabbi Aaron didn't understand, but he goes back with it to Lakewood and he asked the young man how he sets his watch. Now, in those times, if we remember, 60 years ago, 70 years ago, the watches you had to keep on winding up every day, and if it didn't wind up enough, you had to reset the watch. So he was setting his watch every morning at 7 o'clock by the church bell from across the dormitory. So the Rosh Hashiva went and bought him an expensive watch, one which did not need to be set, one of those automatic watches, I guess. And he said, in a condition, I'm giving to you this watch, if you ever need to reset the time, you should do so with the yeshiva's clock. And after a while, the Bacha's mind settled down, and it became an eminent Talmud Chacham. Very nice. Yes, he's the Shver of Zalman Garari, indeed, the Kapishnitzer. So this is a story, a fairly contemporary story, about people giving extra attention to set their clock by the church clock, which isn't a good idea. Now, having this, so these are the two stories which I got, as I said, feedback from the beginning of the week from several people. Indeed, one of them came right after the shiur on Motzei Shabbos. But then we're learning a sicha. So every Shabbos we learn the sicha which is published by Lahak, and this year's from publishing sichas from Tov Shin Lamed Zayin, Shabbos Mevorchim Ador, Chof Daled at Shvat, Tov Shin Lamed Zayin, and the Rebbe is talking about the Poiseach Hashnei Hasipim, the people who are sitting on the fence, and the harm of how it's even worse than a person going to a Baal, because there he knows it's wrong, here he'll never do tshuva, so to speak. So he says, he has the Lashon here, that he has, I know there's a nefesh halakis, the main thing, but I also have a nefesh abamis. A nefesh abamis is a behemoth, so I should be allowed to behave like a behemoth. What's the avla? What's wrong? The nefesh abamis allow the nefesh abamis to carry out its mission to behave like a behemoth. And the Rebbe talks about this, and he's saying, I mean, if this is the way Hashem made the nefesh havamis and my behemoth side of it, I don't want to tamper with the creation. So he's kind of using Yer Shamayim, the Eibishter created me this way, and therefore I shouldn't be tampering with the Eibishter's behemish creation in myself. So here the Rebbe says, and here I found a very interesting line, which the Sichas is published by Lahak is in Hebrew, but this line they brought to the Yiddish, which I've never seen this expression before. The Fall verständig in a matziv of Pesach Hashnei Asifim. Weiß nicht, as sein Hanhog is sheleke de boy. He doesn't know that he's behaving inappropriately. Befrat noch, he encloses this in Yer Shamayim. As dos is ateva, I mean, this my animal inclination is a nature which the Eibishter gave me. Mit Tzad Yer Shamayim hat zu tun mit a Kloster. He's got the word in Yiddish, hat zu tun mit a Kloster, has got to do with a church. I've never seen this expression before. But his Rebbe says his engagement at cloister, it's a dover. He thinks it's Yerushalayim, whatever, but and once he's got that kind of mindset, it's shvere poil nafim tshuvaton, because he doesn't know that he's doing something wrong. So I just saw this. I'm not saying anything definitive about the church bells, etc. But yeah, one has to be careful about this. One has to be careful about this. And I say to Talmidim that there are very intelligent people who are Christians. And you start talking about doctors, lawyers, scientists, and you ask them, what is the, and you don't ask them, but you wonder, the whole message, the Chazan is shtusim. So why are these intelligent people being farchabt? And so there's a clipper, there's a koyach of clipper there, and that's what you're seeing those stories. There's a koyach of clipper. And I just came across also recently in Yerushalmi, in Gemara Shabbos, has a story of someone who had a severe illness, and someone came along and whispered him in the name of Yeshu Pandira. It's otherwise known as Yoshki Pondrik in Yiddish. And he whispered him a healing, perhaps some kind of message of how to heal him. And the person was healed. And there's a whole thing. Was it a good thing? Should he have whatever? But there is a koyach in Tumah. One shouldn't be totally dismissive. And because of it, because it has a koyach, therefore we have to be all the more careful not to be drawn by it. I'm going to finish off with one more thing. Last week I told a story about someone in the middle of Yom. I'm sorry I'm over time, but you'll forgive me another 2 minutes. A person who he was living in, he was visiting Eretz Yisrael, him and his wife, and it was on Yom Tov Sheni that they decided that they're going to remain in Eretz Yisrael, and they went over to Bnei Brak, and Chazon Ish told them to daven mincha, a weekday mincha, and say Atochen Antonu. So also in Yerushalmi, you have this whole story about if Yom Kippur is on Sunday. If Yom Kippur is on Sunday, you don't do Havdalah. And he goes a whole discussion, and he says, well, why don't you make Havdalah when Yom Kippur is on Sunday? Because on Yom Kippur is different. On Yom Shabbos, you're not allowed to wash the vegetables. On Yom Kippur, you are allowed to wash the vegetables to be able to eat Motzei Yom Kippur. So the Rabbi Yossi says, but the heter is only to wash the vegetables in the late afternoon. So therefore, there's no point in making Havdalah when Yom Kippur, on Motzei Shabbos going into Yom Kippur, because the heter, which the new Gemara, which you can do, is only tomorrow afternoon. Okay, so Yom Kippur afternoon. Come to time you now can wash the vegetables, you do Havdalah now. So the Gemara answers, Manavshach, kois ein kan, neir ein kan. There's no cup of wine, there's no neir. But mahu Havdalah, so how are you going to make Havdalah? Or Reb Oven, so Reb Oven says, bitfila, say Atochen Antonu. So very interesting, huh? So you have here Yerushalmi, which leaves this as a question, and the Gemara should say it remains as a kasha. So the concept of saying Atochen Antonu in the middle of the day, so we have here a mocker is mentioned in right. Top word is oif. What's this? Would you make a corner on a quilt cover and not have to on the quilt itself? That's a good question. I don't think so. I think the quilt remains a shiur of Tzitzis regardless. But we've said, Lamaisa, it's a beged lailo, and it's only if you go to sleep during the day with it, then that would be a need to worry about cutting off a corner. Or by the way, if you cut off a quilt corner, make sure you sew it back, because otherwise you'll have feathers all around your house. With that, I'll finish off and wish you a good tavoch, and we should have Suras Hagula with Moshiach, with Moshiach Tzidkenu, Meher Yameinu Mamish.
Oh man.